Hello, family, and welcome once again to our Thurman Thursday. Today is no different than any other. We have an amazing guest for you in the person of Christoph D. Ringer. He is here to talk to us about his amazing book, Necropolitics, the Religious Crisis of Mass Incarceration in America. So I'm going to read a quick bio of this amazing presenter, and then we're just going to jump straight into the evening if that is all right with you all. Christoph D. Ringer serves as Assistant Professor of Theological Ethics and Society at Chicago Theological Seminary in Chicago, Illinois. He is passionate about understanding the relationship between self, society, and the sacred for human flourishing. Ringer received his PhD in Religion, Ethics, and Society from the Vanderbilt University. His research includes African American religion and cultural studies, religion, politics, public theology, and even social ethics. He is the author of Necropolitics, the Religious Crisis of U.S. Mass Incarceration, that examines the religious meanings that sustain mass incarceration today. Ringer is a new leader and thought presenter in our country, and he has done work from the Racial Center of Justice and is married to the wonderful minister Kimberly Peeler Ringer. Without further ado, our speaker for the evening.
Well, it is wonderful to be here. Deep gratitude and thank you for the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel, to Dr. Edward Carter, Brother Cloud, and the Reverend Reinhardt. Thank you once again for this opportunity to be with you and to be in this space and to share this work with you. What I'd like to do is to begin talking a little bit about how this book came about. In many ways, this book originated with an experience, a particular experience and a question. In 1995, I was present at the Million Man March. And I'll never forget, the Reverend Jesse Jackson spoke eloquently about the difference between the sentencing for powder cocaine versus crack cocaine. And he literally just kind of laid out this disparity that many people have been talking about, but had not gained traction, had not gained that kind of national exposure. And during the Million Man March, Reverend Jackson stated 5 years in jail for $45,000 worth of marijuana, 5 years in jail for $8,000 worth of powder, 5 years in jail for $29 worth of crack. It's unfair, it's racist, it's ungodly, it must change. And I remember at the time thinking that now everybody knows, right? That they can't hide this any longer. Now that people know, surely this is going to change, that we're going to turn the corner in the war on drugs. Well, that didn't exactly happen. And maybe at the time it was my own political naivete. But in 1995, you can see from this graph, just over 800,000 people were incarcerated at the federal and state level. That was 95. And after the Million Man March, you can see the graph just continues to go up to the point where we were at over 2 million persons who are incarcerated in state and federal prisons. And as we speak tonight, there are over 7 million persons in this nation who are under some form of correctional control. So part of where this work originated from is the fact that we have lots of social and empirical research on all of the harms that come from mass incarceration as a public policy. There is tons of research on the collateral consequences or the punishments that continue after people have already served their time. Whether they are shut out of the job market, whether they are regulated to the low end of the labor market, whether they are politically disenfranchised, the profound effects on families and children. So given all the harms that we already know about, that have been documented, my question was, why does this persist? And how is it that such a social problem could grow to this scale without complete moral outrage? So you often will hear mass incarceration described in various ways. Some people refer to it as the new Jim Crow. Some people have argued that it is genocide. It is the new slavery, post-slavery. You've heard people talk about the 13th Amendment. So part of what this project was trying to do is to say, what exactly is going on? And how do we understand mass incarceration as it relates to earlier forms of subjugation, whether it is slavery, new Jim Crow, etc. And so I take these debates very seriously. Right? These are academic debates, but here's the thing. How you understand a problem will often determine how you respond to it. So part of this project was to say, what is mass incarceration? To distinguish what it is from what it resembles. How is it the same or different from the era of Jim Crow? How is it the same or different from the era of slavery? Right? What is the logic that is coming down through American history, that here we are once again facing this extraordinary challenge, another regime of subjugating Black people? And so my research took me to an unlikely place. It took me to the Puritan era. It took me to an era in which there was a tradition that I was not aware of. And it is a tradition of what we call execution sermons. And during the Puritan era, the era where we found the language of the city on the hill that has been so much a part of American political discourse. And in this era, family, state, cosmos, the entire nation was thought to have been guided by God providentially. And the criminal was understood as an ungrateful, disobedient child, resulting in later offenses against society for which the state punishes, and then the criminal will receive their just deserts in hell. In the New England colonies, the execution of a criminal was a profound religious and political event. Execution sermons were designed, and you have to imagine here a minister standing next to someone who is going to be condemned. And the goal of this execution sermon was to get those who were assembled to identify with the condemned as partakers in original sin, in hopes that they would then offer their own confession and repentance. But something would happen in these sermons when the offender was Black. In these sermons, you could see that the meaning of Black criminality was interpreted as a form of ingratitude, disobedience, a base and greedy hankering for freedom and financial independence. Execution sermons during this time routinely served as warnings to Blacks as well as white and Native American servants about the desire for freedom. Theologically, Black criminals stand in for Black people, and their death represents the result of those who desire freedom. The message then of these sermons was that Black people are unfit for civil society. And what you see in these sermons is an understanding that will literally be a thread throughout American history, that criminality isn't just about crime, but criminality is associated with the question as to whether or not Black people are fit for freedom, whether we are fit for self-governance and participation in the political community. More importantly, Black criminals were understood as a threat to the well-ordered society, as well as our understanding of the cosmos, right? So again, I want to emphasize that family, state, cosmos, all being understood as infused and guided by God, and the Black criminal was a threat to that order. So part of what I do in the book is to begin to trace these images of Black people as animals and criminals, and how that enters into the very rationality of governance, right? The very ordering of society, and the reasons why we pursue certain kinds of public policies. Also, too, I draw on the work of Charles Long, a seminal figure in the study of Black religion. And Charles Long refers to what he calls the arche, or the religious depth of American culture. And this religious depth is something that the culture draws upon in times of crisis. And what I argue in the book is that the animalization and criminalization of Black people is actually a part of the religious depth of American society. And whenever we are going through social upheavals, those images are drawn upon. Give you just a few examples that I detail in the book. The first is the cocaine-crazed Negro. This mythology really was the origin of how the United States even began getting into the business of regulating narcotics. This actually came out of a time when there was a huge anti-Chinese backlash. There were Chinese workers who built railroads throughout the West, and there were what they call opium dens. And opium dens, there was a problem. There was a social problem with addiction, but the racism against the Chinese was virulent. And China had a real problem with this. So America had a problem. They needed Chinese labor. But the racism in America was pushing them out. And so at the end of the day, China and America essentially struck a deal that America would address the addiction problem with opium through regulation if China would continue sending them laborers. Well, this posed a problem for the South. The South did not want federal intervention. They didn't want federal regulation of narcotics because they felt that that would upset the racial order, that federal intervention would mean that Black people might take advantage of that in order to attain social advancement. So this mythology of the cocaine-crazed Negro received legitimation from scientists, and the image that you're seeing is from the New York Times. And what this did was it allowed the South to accept federal intervention. It allowed the South to support the federal regulation of drugs. Why? Because the assumption was that when Black people would take drugs or like cocaine, that somehow or another we would become fiends, that so-called docile Negroes would become courageous, that somehow or another Black people would rape white women. And so what you see is that this mythology gains the backing not only of science, but of culture and politics. And the reason why this is critical theologically is that part of what I trace in the book is that the effects of these beliefs, the effects of this mythology, is to cast Black people as unredeemed and unredeemable, in need of ongoing discipline and containment and correction. We see the same theme in Ronald Reagan's public theology, where here this quote actually comes from a speech that Reagan gave to all of the police chiefs in America. They were gathered for a conference in New Orleans. And here, Ronald Reagan is drawing on these animalistic images, where he says a portrait emerges, the portrait of a stark, staring face, a face that belongs to a frightening reality of our time, the face of a human predator, the face of a habitual criminal. Once again, you see this thread of casting Black people as animals, which means that we are not fit for society, right? We are in the state of nature rather than civil society, but also this idea of the habitual criminal, one that has chosen not to participate in public life, one that already is understood as guilty and in need of discipline. This also comes at a particular time in our nation's history, shortly after the civil rights movement, and when America has been in economic distress. Right? You see these images once again that are called upon in order to essentially not only disenfranchise a major segment of the population, but also to withdraw support for social justice. And here you have Ronald Reagan making this argument in 1981 that the root causes of our major domestic problem, the growth of government and the decay of the economy, can be traced to many of the same sources as the crime problem. This is because the same utopian presumptions about human nature that hinder swift administration of justice have also helped fuel the expansion of government. In other words, Ronald Reagan is making a theological argument that about human nature, right? That human nature, people is good or bad, regardless of social circumstance, regardless of poverty, educational opportunities, etc., and that we should just punish. And so what he is doing is saying government should get out of the business of supporting social justice, and we should be in the business of punishment. So one of the things that you see especially in the 80s and throughout the 90s, is this constant drumbeat that government is too large, small government. But at the same time, when it comes to the amount of money we can spend on jails and prisons, we have no problem spending as much as we need to spend. There was a Catholic theologian known as Michael Novak. And Michael Novak was extremely influential in government. He is the theological voice in many of Ronald Reagan's speeches. He is a theological architect of what we now refer to often as neoliberalism, or a certain kind of ideology of government that focuses on privatization, the liberation of capital, the rolling back of government regulation. And Michael Novak was very instrumental in putting forth a vision where the criminal is not in need of rehabilitation, but rather the criminal is an enemy of the human race. And so in my book, I want to take very seriously what happens when you have these long-standing images of Black people as animals and criminals, and then you have a public theology that begins to situate the criminal as an enemy of the human race, right? And also situates the criminal as the cause of essentially the loss of virtue in the nation and the demise of the nation itself. Also, another example of how I track these influences. There was a political scientist by the name of John DeLulio Jr., and he came up with a theory, right, regarding super predators. He actually predicted that we would see a wave of young, predominantly Black youth that he calls super predators, who were fearless, godless, and jobless. And his theory was taken seriously. It was taken seriously not only in religious circles, but also in politics. It was taken seriously by those with political power. Many years later, his theory was debunked. But by the time it was debunked, by the time we knew that this was just a stereotype, that there was no empirical evidence that his predictions were wrong, so much damage had already happened, right? That these images were critical in legitimating and supporting and promoting mass incarceration in America. One of the things that I focus on also in the book is a way in which this thread running throughout American history regarding Black criminality as a threat to the well-ordered society, a threat to law and order. And you can see this recently in this past summer in the response to many of the protests by Black Lives Matter against police brutality. And here Tucker Carlson says, if we're going to survive as a country, we must defeat Black Lives Matter. So again, this idea of Black freedom, this idea of Black protest, not just as a social problem, but a threat to the very existence of the nation. So one of the things that I talk about towards the end of the book is that these moments of crisis, right, when America calls upon this religious depth, this really is, I frame this as America's God. In these moments, America calls upon this deep religious sense. And there is a role for faith communities in particular to critique this deep religious and theological sensibility that continues to criminalize and subordinate Black communities. And I talk about three forms of judgment. One, there is the judgment of Blacks as animals and criminals, unworthy of political participation. But then also there is the judgment that happens with police officers. Right? The use of deadly force is also a profound form of judgment. The next form of judgment comes through sentencing. Right? When people are sentenced to jail or prison, they literally are sentenced to hell. What do I mean by that? I don't mean that just to try to be provocative. Rather, in the Christian tradition, if we think about heaven and hell, hell is a place where, is a space, right, a place that you are going to suffer, right, and it is a place of judgment. Prisons, literally, is the use of space and time as a form of punishment. So I want theologically to take seriously that we have created a system of hell on earth, right? The use of time and space as a form of judgment and punishment instead of working towards a just society. That we have created a political economy where we continue to punish the problems that we produce. So that is kind of where this research, this book originated from. Those are some of the major themes, and I also flesh those out in a number of different ways. Thank you so much for your time.
Dr. Ringer, I am completely at a loss for words for how adequately you name the existential crisis of mass incarceration in this country. Mm-hmm. There really is nothing left to be said after one reads this very exhaustive text about mass incarceration. Just for the listeners, mm-hmm. I want to frame a working definition of necropolitics. Okay. It is the use of social and political power to dictate how some people may live and some must die. Mm-hmm. I think it's important that we talk about how those people who are in positions of power not only determine how some may live, some have the option to live, and then they determine how others must die, that they have to die a certain way. Mm-hmm. In your book, you set the stage, as you just stated, with Charles Long, but then you also talk about social death in the American experience. Mm-hmm. Can you delve a little deeper into that, its origins, and how that really matters to us today?
Right. Sure. So part of what I mean by social death within the book is twofold. One is images, right, of Black people that situate us outside of civil society, right? And then two, actual death. Right? And part of what necropolitics draws upon is another kind of body of research and theories that focus on what we call biopolitics. And biopolitics really is a way of stating that at the heart of politics in contemporary society is life, right? So our debates about healthcare, our debates about abortion, end of life issues, right? So that government is thoroughly intertwined, right, with all of the sciences that address human life. So there's not a separation between issues of life and issues of politics. Rather, the object of politics today is life itself, right, and populations. But necropolitics says that's only half the story, right? That we live in a society in which the lives of some are predicated on oftentimes the social death and actual death of others.
Wow.
Right. And that's been true since the origin of America. And I trace kind of different manifestations of this. I'll give you just one simple example. When the insurrection happened on January 6th, many Black people were looking at the screen, looking at the TV, and beyond a shadow of a doubt, right, that if those folks had been Black, it would have been a massacre, right? It would have been a tragedy of just horrible proportions. So there's a way in which running through American history, there is an understanding of freedom and liberty, right, for whites that is predicated on the social and actual death of Black folk. And so I wanted to bring that into, right, that understanding of biopolitics, right, that we really can't understand what's going on with mass incarceration without that kind of analysis.
And it's really funny how you mentioned the insurrection that happened on January 6th. Everybody knows what we're talking about there. That was the principal example that I wrote down when looking at all of the examples throughout this text.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the juxtaposition of persons of color and social death, and then the ability for white people to continue to escape that social death by doing the same things that they claim persons of color do every day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
With the election of President Joe Biden, a lot of people brought up another section of what you talk about in another section of your book with super predators.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people brought up that piece of legislation that was so popular then with Hillary Clinton and a lot of other, Hillary Clinton when she ran, and a lot of other politicians at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about the importance of the animalization that you talk about in this text and this super predator idea?
Right. Yeah. So I think, one of the things that I try to bring out in the book is that, that language of super predator was bipartisan, right? I mean, across the political spectrum, it had currency. So but part of what I wanted to also tease out is we have to talk about why it is that language was able to gain that traction, right? And it was able to gain that traction because there's a history of these images of Black people as animals and criminals, right? So again, going back to the idea of the cocaine fiend, right? The idea of crack babies, crackheads, all of these images that position us as having these unrestrained desires, propensities for violence. And so that language really was critical in passing really punitive, right, public policies. And also, too, super predators represents what we call a kind of moral panic. And when you have a moral panic, oftentimes it's easy to push through legislation without much discussion, or without much critical discussion. And then, two, another important point about that language, in particular the image, is that let's just take a city like Chicago, right? Oftentimes, images or representations are ways in which we make judgments about people who live in communities we've never been in, right? So those images actually mediate, right, public policies because we make assumptions about who is over there. We make assumptions about other communities. And, it becomes a part of our political fabric. It becomes a part of actually our governing logic.
Wow, that's amazing. We have a question here from actually Reverend Reinhardt. Dr. Ringer, can you talk about the ways in which Michel Foucault's theory of panopticon affects the lives of Black folk in the public square in relationship to this idea of necropolitics?
Great question. So just so we're on the same page, Michel Foucault's notion of the panopticon, a certain kind of prison, if you will, in which those who the guards can see everyone, right? I think there are two things I want to talk about in relationship to that. One is the question of surveillance, right? The everyday, ordinary surveillance of Black life. And there's a way in which that is also in a ongoing theme throughout American history, right? The ongoing surveillance of Black life, and as it relates to necropolitics, that ongoing surveillance often positions us as already culpable.
Yes.
Right? Already guilty, right? Already, ripe for some kind of engagement with the police. And so that question of, for example, take, any number of the videos over the past 5 years that we've seen of Black people being brutalized or killed by the police. And part of what you have to ask is, why are we spending so many resources to surveil people who are selling cigarettes? Right? Why are we using so much of our tax dollars to police and surveil people who are selling tapes? Right? So this question of surveillance, I think, is critical, because what it does is it increases the exposure, right, to actual potential death.
Yes.
It increases the exposure to the structures of policing and jails and prison.
So moving a little deeper into that, the idea of the white gaze, how do persons of color escape that in an era where they are consistently and constantly surveilled by majority, which would be white people?
Right. That's a tough question. There are no easy answers, but I do say this. One, it means deep political engagement. I don't think there's a substitute for that. It also means, I think, for faith communities, turning a critical eye to the ways in which our theologies support that kind of surveillance and that kind of policing. So I think there's a role for our religious communities, right, to play here in kind of disrupting our theological support of that kind of policing. But the other issue is really to think about critically political engagement that uses technology for the purposes of freedom, right, and not just ongoing invasive surveillance. And here I'm thinking of the work of people like Ruha Benjamin and some other Black scholars who are starting to disrupt and to question what are the assumptions that go into the algorithms, right? And you can, and this is happening even in local communities, where activists are saying, look, when you have risk assessments, right, being used by judges as to whether or not someone can be released out on bail, those risk assessment algorithms are not neutral, right? They already include certain forms of bias, right? And so really kind of identifying those points of intervention in the range of forms of surveillance.
So shifting from that portion, maybe back to your beginning where you talk about the Puritan execution sermons.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that today, in certain ways, we are still rendering these execution sermons?
Yes. Now here's my hesitation that you heard. Right. So necropolitics is a part of our traditions.
Yes.
Right. There are some scholars who talk. Vincent Brown, for example, brilliant scholar of African history, African American history, and he talks about mortuary politics.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So when the decision is made to have an open casket funeral for Emmett Till, right, to show the world what this nation does, that's a form of necropolitics. Right. So there's a necropolitics that is deployed against us. But then there's a kind of necropolitics that we use to push back, right, wow. and to kind of reverse that. Right? So the other reason why I answered yes to your question is that part of what I discovered in looking at these execution sermons is that in addition to the sermon, oftentimes the conversation with the minister and the condemned beforehand was also published.
Right.
Right, and these sold in the thousands of copies. So what's interesting in this moment is that there's an emergence of literature that begins to communicate the interiority of Black people to the public. So you have autobiographies, you have slave narratives, you have these genres of writing, right, that for the first time you are communicating the thoughts, right, the dreams, the memories, all of the interior life of Black people, but that also includes these execution sermons. It also includes Black people who are self-consciously engaging in a conversation, knowing that their words are going to be read after they're dead. So I want to draw a historical line between that literature and the kind of prevalence and the kind of ambiguities, rather, not prevalence, the ambiguities of Black death on video in our current moment.
I think that's an interesting line to be drawn. In your presentation today, you posted a picture of Reagan, and then there was another image of Tucker Carlson. If people don't know, Tucker Carlson is a political pundit per se on Fox News who participates, to me, in a lot of race baiting and coded language, to be honest. I saw the 4 years of President Trump. To me, he was a mix between Reagan, Nixon, Andrew Jackson, all rolled into one. His language, how do you feel that affected the movement of persons of color toward a new system? How do you think, or do you feel that President Trump's words and presidency have set us back to the space of being called super predators, that time period?
So I think that Trump is a perfect example of what Charles Long means by the arcade. Right, here you have someone who was unapologetically, right, racist, right, who begins his campaign talking about immigrants as animals. He explicitly says they're not human, right? They're rapists, etc. So there's a way in which Trump represents this arcade, right, without any veneer, right, without any kind of other mitigating factors that you could point to, right? And so what you see then with Trump is, and this is the movement that he is kind of leading, is you can trace a line all the way back that it is about white minority rule. Yes. It is about a vision of freedom that does not include Black people participating in the structures of sovereignty, in the structures of governance, right? And so one of the kind of deeply symbolic aspects of what happened on January 6th is that it's no accident that we woke up that morning celebrating Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff. And yet by the end of the day, we saw this insurrection, which was really a kind of reclaiming of this original vision of America, right, as only being for for white people and minority white rule.
Mm-hmm. In the comments, I just saw someone said, this is the idea of manifest destiny, that being of God, gold, and glory, I believe. The final question I have for you kind of goes back to your origins, and I would feel your passions as a minister. You say, in the end, moving beyond the era of mass incarceration will require a profound struggle by a critical mass of citizens against the necropolitics that is both material and immaterial. Placing that in the view or the gaze of the church, how does that work when we are still preaching that there is a heaven and a hell and there is no way to get out of this hell that can be this life or the afterlife? How do we do that?
So I think that's a starting point, right? And part of what I want to do is to affirm the church in that the church has a language to help us understand the dynamics of necropolitics, right? If we're willing to use it. So we have a language that, just let me give you one example. You know, when we say, when on Sunday morning, whether it's virtually now or previously in person,
right,
we get excited about what God has done for us and that we have been given a second chance, right? Do we extend that second chance to others? Right? What is the relationship between this grace that has been extended to us, right, to have a second chance, if you will, and how does that relate to who we are as citizens? Right? What is the how does that that theological claim on our lives influence our public witness? Also, too, you know, there is there's a long history of Christian thought which says that when a president or a king, when they go to war, right, they are pronouncing judgment upon the earth.
Yes.
Because only God can pronounce the judgments of life and death.
Right.
So I think that there is a moment now in which churches need to say these police killings, it's not just a matter of injustice, that there's a theological problem here, right? That we are allowing certain citizens under the guise of policing to exercise the power of life and death, to exercise a power that rightly belongs to God, and to exercise it in ways that with impunity, right? With regularity, and without accountability. So there are a number of theological entry points that I think churches really can, that I think it's part of our calling to address. If we really think about our own preaching and teaching, and to really think about how is that already participating in the criminal justice system.
Well, Dr. Ringer, thank you so much for being with us this evening and walking us through this amazing text that you have. Would you have any final closing statements for us?
Just to say thank you for this invitation. Thank you for reading the book, right? And I would just say, there is so much work to be done.
Yeah.
And I would ask, all those who are viewing to begin to think about where they can enter into this work, because it truly is going to take a mass movement to begin to address all of the entanglements regarding mass incarceration.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. One final question for you.
Mm-hmm.
What 3 books are you reading right now, or what 3 books should we all be invested in picking up today?
I have to recommend a book by Alex Vitale, Vitale. It's called The End of Policing. It's a really accessible text, brilliantly argued, and it's written to make a public impact. And I think it's such a timely book because when people talk about defund the police, we have a certain kind of immediate kind of knee-jerk reaction.
Right.
But he kind of lays out the case to say, wait a minute. Let's look at what police are actually doing. Let's look at, he's dismantling all of the assumptions regarding kind of how we feel when we hear the language of defund the police. Mm-hmm. There is a book out now by Miriam Kaba called We Do This Until We're Free. Miriam Kaba really is one of the influential figures in the work of abolition and thinking about abolition today. And I think that there is a way in which her work is not explicitly theological, but it is very much rooted in a kind of, really, it's a faith. It is a profound form of hope. And I think we are going to need religious leaders to really think about what is our contribution to abolishing, right, this particular, I shouldn't say particular, abolishing this latest iteration, right, of social injustice.
Yeah.
Right, that we're in the midst of what some people call a third Reconstruction.
Right.
And to discern what our role is in that. So I think those two are critical texts to be reading.
Those two are perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Ringer, for your time, and we will definitely be in touch with you later. God bless.
Right. Thank you so much. God bless.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, family, you have come, and we have stopped into your living rooms and your homes, your classrooms, just to have a small conversation about how we can advance this world together. Sunday at 5:30 at our evening Vesper hour, we will be graced with Minister Taylin Lancaster of Clark Atlanta University and a member of our executive team. So we hope that you'll come and be our guest once again. There is nothing else from me, but as I always say, we love you and there is nothing you can do about it. God bless, and we'll see you next time.